Hello and a very warm welcome to Money Control. I am Shweta Punch. The last few years has seen the world transform for better or for worse. The pandemic and the war raging in Ukraine have forced countries to look inwards. As the world becomes increasingly deglobalized, India too has adopted some extreme measures, such as banning of exports of non-basmati rice, which was announced recently, and banning of wheat exports that happened last year. That's not all. India has also imposed restrictions on import of laptops, PCs, and tablets. There is a very clear and strategic turn on India's trade policy, which many have termed as the return of the license Raj. Do such protectionist measures serve India's interests, or is it in India's interest to go for these? Is it hurting India's reputation as a reliable supplier, especially in the case of non basmati rice? To understand this turn in India's trade policy and what it could mean for India, I'm joined by two trade experts, Professor Bhanumurthy from B.R. Ambedkar School of Economics and Somnath Mukherjee of ASK Investment Advisors. Thank you very much, Mr. Mukherjee and Professor Bhanumurthy, for joining us. Let me begin by posing this question to the two of you. There is a clear change in India's trade policy. It seems like India is becoming increasingly inward looking. We are becoming increasingly protectionist. One might argue that that's the need of the hour. I want to get your thoughts in. Let me begin with you, Somnath.
Yeah, I think it's not very unique to India. It isn't just India that has pivoted somewhat from the global consensus of the last 30, 40 years about free trade. Globally, we see governments, polities making a fairly sharp move away from theoretical canons of free trade practices. We see the US taking major steps in terms of protecting certain types of domestic industry. The CHIPS Act, for example, giving out very significant subsidies for insuring of critical commodities, products, and semiconductors, and so on and so forth. And we see that across the board everywhere else as well in Europe. So some of the champions of free trade are also pivoting. So India joining the bandwagon is hardly a case of us being Robinson Crusoe. So I don't think it's something unique to India.
Sure.
Obviously, every country will choose its battles in this depending on its own praxis, but broadly, not something that is unexpected in the current global scenario.
Mhm. I want to bring in Professor Bhanumurthy. Professor Bhanumurthy, this is also the year of India's G20 presidency. India has been, very vociferous at the UN Security Council. So, clearly India is placing itself in a very strategic position on the global stage. Now, with the ban on exports of non-basmati rice, India is a major rice supplier. We've imposed restrictions on imports of laptops, PCs, and so on. Do you think it's some sort of a mixed messaging that even while the world is doing it, is it right for India to do so?
Well, Shweta, thank you very much for having me to this session. I think the timing of these policy measures, as you rightly pointed out, that India is taking so many initiatives under the G20. I feel it is not really right time in my view. And just because some advanced countries have done, we don't need to be part of the bandwagon for a simple reason. There's empirically, theoretically, historically, I think it has been shown very well that any trade, constraints or restrictions will not have any welfare impact in the long run. So I think that is something that is being proved many number of times. So I thought this was an opportunity for India to take a global stage, where I think he's already in the global stage, but I thought it has to really fight for what we keep talking about, China plus one. And I think that was an opportunity for India to make its policies more consistent and predictable, such a way that the long-term investors actually they started looking at India. I mean, as you all know, that India is a bright spot right now, not only for the current year, in fact, for the next couple of years, because advanced countries in extremely in bad shape. So I think there's so much of focus on India right now, and this was the time the Indian policy should have been more predictable, more consistent, and I thought it might hamper the long-term investment strategies of the private investors. Maybe there are short-term benefits, but I think this kind of policies will have a huge repercussions on the long-term sustainability and stability of the growth. So, in that sense, whatever happened in the month of July, I'm slightly disappointed.
Okay, let me bring in Mr. Mukherjee. Mr. Mukherjee, you are an optimist on this. You said that India is new to this game. You wrote an exhaustive editorial on this, where you pointed out that while India is new to this game, countries like the United States have done this very cleverly in the last many decades, using food as a very strategic lever. How do you see India using food as a strategic lever? Because last year we banned the exports of wheat, and we know how that panned out. India did ban the export of non-basmati rice in 2007, which saw prices doubling within 6 months. So, how do you see this panning out for India?
Right. So I think on the food side, it's not just a one way. It's also a case of keeping domestic prices under control. You mentioned the measures in 2007 that actually prevented prices from going up too sharply and dampened inflation in what could have been a much worse inflationary scenario. But that apart, let's get to the example of wheat that you quoted of last year. Despite the ban, India actually ended up exporting more last year than it did the year before that.
Mm.
So the ban only meant that India made export of wheat a strategic tool than an open market operation. And that strategic tool enables India to barter an essential commodity, wheat in this case, for other strategic objectives with specific targeted countries.
So, can you give
Economists,
me an example here? Can you give
yeah.
me an example of
So,
which
for
country?
example,
Yeah.
the example I quoted about Egypt. Now, Egypt has been traditionally a large importer of wheat from Ukraine and Russia. Now, that route suddenly shut down overnight once the invasion started, and India emerged as a potential alternative for Egypt. Now, the final imports by Egypt was reasonably small, but still material enough to move the dial for them. And in lieu of that, a relationship that had somewhat gone into a bit of a slumber suddenly sprung back to life. LCC, the president of Egypt, was the chief guest in the Republic Day parade this year. Prime Minister Modi was in Egypt a couple of months back. Part of the conversations between India and Egypt today include sale of critical military equipment made in India to Egypt, including Akash surface-to-air missiles, potentially the Tejas fighter aircraft, and so on and so forth. This level of conversation simply didn't happen for many years prior to that. So we obviously traded an ephemeral short-term window for potentially longer-term strategic benefits. Not something that has not been done before by others, and not something that we should shy away from doing as well.
Sure. So,
So
how do you see
this,
this rice situation panning out? 140 countries that have solely dependent on India for rice. Barclays put out a report saying that this could lead to a rice mayhem of sorts. So, how do you see this situation panning out? What are the levers that India could use? What are the countries that India could, tap into and build on their strategic relationships?
yeah. So the good thing about the rice situation is India's own inventories are well beyond what is the minimum mandated norms that we have for ourselves. So there is slack within. But how it will pan out, only time will tell. But if the experience of last year is anything to go by, we might be having the same conversation same time next year and find that we have ended up exporting more rice this year than we did last year. Who
Right, but
knows?
next year, this time there'll probably be a new government in power, so we'll see how that pans
Who
out.
knows? Yes. See,
Yeah.
the thing about this is this. For the longest time, economists have been advocating targeted subsidies, targeted welfare, targeted benefits. So this is an extension of that. India is targeting exports of critical commodities that are in global shortage for the
Okay.
maximum benefit as a quid pro quo. Um,
Sure.
I don't
Okay.
see the problem
Let me
with
let
that
me
at all.
let me bring in Professor Bhanumurthy here. Professor Bhanumurthy, is this an economic strategic decision, as Somnath would have you believe, or do you think this is a decision that's been prodded by political compulsions, because we are looking at high inflation across a lot of product categories, and rice again is a big part of a lot of government schemes. There could be, well, for now our stocks are looking good, but is this something, is the government being a little too paranoid while pressing the accelerator on something, a move like this?
No, I think many of the policies that we see in the recent period is actually keeping, I think, mostly forward looking. I think actually keeping what exactly happens from December, January, February period. So I think even the rise, in my view, maybe next year and the hindsight we might say many things what actually happened in terms of the strategic relationships, but right now it looks like the kind of early warning that we are getting from the performance of the monsoon is only putting pressure on the government to ensure that the inflation expectations, especially on the food prices, don't go up, because inflation is a very very sensitive variable for the political economy, in my view. So I think it looks like they seems to be taking care, that such kind of exploding of the prices, as you rightly pointed out, what happened in 2007-8. So I don't think this policy is independent of the of 2024 elections. So I think it mostly because of the domestic compulsion the government seems to be doing. So I hope that works out well for domestic economy.
But I
But
want
as
to
you
ask,
rightly,
I want to ask Somnath and you this: how does
yeah,
this pan out for the farmers? When the government intervenes in free markets like this, we had a farmer on Money Control last week, and he was very vociferously against government intervention in free markets. In fact, even on tomatoes, he said, why did the government have to go to NAFED, and why did cheaper tomatoes have to come into the market? Let the markets decide, because there was a time when tomatoes were 10 rupees a kilo, and there was a glut in the market. So, I want to ask this question to both of you. While we're talking about food security, while we're talking about elections, what happens to the farmer on ground when measures and interventions like these are taken? Somnath.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, and the first thing to be understood is that by design the farm market is not an open market, and we do have, certainly for rice and wheat, the major food products, there is an MSP regime that is in place. And in some ways, that's the grand bargain, that when prices are low because of global factors or bumper production, there will be a safety net that provides the bottom. And in lieu of that, that same safety net will provide the upper cap for domestic consumers when global prices are high or when production is lower. So I think it's a tricky one for any government to navigate and find the right balance. The Indian
Right.
government has been doing this, irrespective of political dispensation. They've been doing this for a very long time. But to say that this is a free market issue is just not correct, because it is not.
Okay.
There is no free market being invoked when global prices of rice are, say, half of what they are today. At that time, the what is being invoked is, how can we ensure food security if we don't have a safety net? So it's
Sure.
not a free market, but
Let
it's
me
a
let me
balancing act.
Sure. Let me go across to Professor Bhanumurthy. We were just talking about how rural demand has been somewhat sticky. We've not seen rural demand come up, and considering the monsoons have been somewhat erratic, rural demand could stay subdued. Right now, farm sector is a huge component of this rural demand. Uh, I want to get your sense on, how do measures like this impact the farmer, impact their income, which ultimately has a spillover effect on the entire economy.
Yeah, I think it will have huge repercussions on the rural economy. I think for some reason we don't consider agriculture as an industry, and for some reasons we keep interfering in day-to-day functions of the agriculture markets, and that's one of the reasons why commodity markets in India is a non-starter. So when we compare with advanced countries, we have a much better, vibrant commodity exchanges and all those things. But when it comes to India, it's just a non-starter. So coming to your point about the rural demand and rural economy, as I said in the beginning, I think this year is going to be a crisis in the agriculture sector for various reasons, and I don't think there's going to be revival in the agriculture in the rural demand until the beginning of the next year because of the various reasons. And I think on top of it, this kind of a macro policy intervention, particularly coming from the central government, I think it will have its own huge repercussions on the rural demand, whatever small it was, that is going to be affected. So I think the government has to be very careful right now. But that is not the end of the story. If there is no rural demand, I think there's going to be huge pressure on the fiscal in the current year. I think government may need to pump in more money into the rural segment, either in terms of MGNREGS or even the National Food Security Act. So they may need to spend more money under those kind of schemes. So I
Mhm.
think this also is going to create confusion in the system rather than bringing more clarity.
Okay. I also want to bring in the decision to impose restrictions on imports of laptops and PCs and tablets. Somnath, your first thoughts on it? Because they're very divided. It's very divided house there.
Hmm.
A big section is saying this is return of the license charge. Import restrictions are not going good. It's like going back to the 80s. I want to get your sense and your inputs on
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, I think maybe the communications and planning part of it was a little bit undercooked, and the government has quickly sort of tackled that by postponing implementation. But fundamentally, it's not something again that has not been seen. Uh, we have to make a difference between liberalization and free markets for domestic production versus liberalization of imports and trade. As we mentioned right at the beginning, the latter is coming under increased scrutiny across the world, and it's not just restricted to India. It is also a fact that, barring a few notable exceptions, most countries in the world, including advanced economies in the West, industrialization did not happen via free trade, but industrialization happened mostly via smart protectionism. The likes of most of the European countries, industrialization was a function of colonial expansion. For most of Asia post World War II, industrialization was facilitated by a grand bargain of sorts with the West, especially the United States, where most of Asia, certainly East Asia, swapped political allegiances of sorts for market access, which was a one way market access to the US. And a lot of these economies themselves, in their local markets, had significant barriers to entry for Western companies to come in for both imports and initially for production as well. In India, one of our signature success stories on the industrial front, which is autos, followed a very similar template, wherein import of autos were always made very difficult behind extremely high tariff walls. On the other hand, domestic production by the same global auto majors who would potentially export to us were under much looser, much more liberal, and much lower tariff regimes. I think the attempt right now is to replicate the same model in laptops as well. Uh, Point to be noted is that one of our largest sources of trade deficit, including our trade deficit with China, is on electronics imports. You have to start somewhere on that. Now, nothing can get done in a jiffy, in a hurry. But given where the world is going, it's a template that has worked in a certain context for us. It's a template that has worked in different contexts for a range of countries. So there is no reason for us to continue on a template where our trade deficit, especially with China, keeps ballooning on account of large electronics imports. I think it's a measure in that direction. Now, whether the I's and the T's were all perfectly dotted and crossed is something that can be debated, and maybe they were not, and some correctives have been taken. But over the next few years and months, this is a path I think most of the world has taken, and India is simply in the same bandwagon.
Okay, Professor
Can I
Bhanamurthy, I
begin?
want to get your thoughts in. Yes, I
Yeah,
want to get
yeah,
your thoughts in on this.
yes. My thought is completely opposite of what Somnath says. See, the trade reforms or trade liberalization and the benefits of trade liberalization actually happened through reduction in the cost of production. The export competitiveness depends heavily on the cost of production. I think the cost of production is the one major variable if you want to really compete with other competitors in the outside world, and especially when you want to compete with China. So I think for that you need to bring in policies which will reduce the cost of production rather than increasing the cost of production. Now, if you look at these import tariffs, in fact, one of the most respected trade specialist like Arvind Pangaria was criticizing this government for increasing import tariffs. But if you compare between import tariffs and licenses, I still go with import tariff than the license because you just don't know what is the cost of getting license. At least you know the what is the cost of importing when there is an import tariff is imposed on the commodities. So I think this license system is going to be a big drag on India's long-term trade, and I don't think that is the strategy what we need to adopt if you really want to take on countries like China. So you need to be part of the global value chain. I think we have seen how the global value chains actually helped India's, I mean, many countries' production and also bringing down the cost of production. And we need to really be very careful when we talk about India's trade. We need to have policies something different for services and also policies for manufacturing sector. So services we are very
Sure.
competitive, so you don't need to have any restrictions on that. But I think on the manufacturing, it is very important for all of us to recognize manufacturing exports depends increasingly depending on imports. I think import led export growth strategy has been empirically proved at least in the post reform period. So any increase in the import cost I think will lead to export cost. I think that's very simple. I think what Arvind Pangera says, import tariffs are
Right,
nothing but export cost. So I think
right.
we need to be careful in bringing this kind of policies just in the name of reducing the trade deficit with China.
All right. Thank you so much. We had both sides of the story on the show, and I think that's the best kind of a discussion where you have two opposing points of view. India cannot go back to the 70s and 80s, which was an India of paucity and licenses and red tape. But India, as Somnath pointed out, and many have said that India is following the playbook that has been successful in other parts of the world. Only time will tell, whether these policies will pan out the way they are intentioned to work out for India, or could they boomerang for India. When I do hope that India is has been a country that's been associated with red tape, and a lot of work has gone in to disassociate the two. So I just hope that these licenses and multiple permissions required do not take us back to where we started from. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to hear both of you speak and, of course, share your views. And we look forward to having you back on Money Control. Thanks so much for watching. We do hope that you found this conversation useful. Do send us your thoughts and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.